On May 21, 1945, at a checkpoint in northern Germany, a small group of former Soviet prisoners of war captured 3 German soldiers who were trying to flee. Among them, one stood out for his unusual appearance, a shaved head and an eye patch. His documents identified him as Sergeant Heinrich Himmler, but as the interrogations progressed, he made a shocking revelation. By removing the eye patch and adjusting his glasses, he asked to speak with the Allied generals and revealed his true identity. Heinrich Hitler, the feared Reichsführer, SS, and right-hand man of Adolf Hitler. With his capture, the Allies finally laid their hands on the most wanted man of the Nazi regime after the death of Hitler. His final days are very interesting. Get ready. Before anything, it is crucial to understand Himmler's relationship with Hitler. Understanding this will make everything make sense in the final days of the leader of the SSs. As second in command of the CCS and later Reichsführer SS, Himmler was in regular contact with Hitler to organize the presence of SS members as personal guards. Himmler was not involved in party policy-making decisions in the years prior to the seizure of power. From the late 1930s onward, the SS were independent from the control of other state agencies or government departments, and he reported only to Hitler. Hitler promoted and practiced the Führerprinzip. The principle demanded absolute obedience of all subordinates to their superiors. Thus, Hitler viewed the governmental structure as a pyramid, with himself as the infallible leader at the top. In accordance with this, Himmler placed himself in a position of subordination to Hitler, being unconditionally obedient to him. However, he, like other high-ranking Nazi officials, had aspirations of one day succeeding Hitler as leader of the Reich. Himmler considered Albert Speer a particularly dangerous rival, both in the administration of the Reich and as a possible successor to Hitler. Hitler called Himmler's mystical and pseudo-religious interests nonsense. Himmler was not a member of Hitler's inner circle. The two men were not very close, and they rarely saw each other socially. Hitler socialized almost exclusively with other members of the SS. His unconditional loyalty and efforts to please Hitler earned him the nickname Der treue Heinrich, the faithful Heinrich. However, in the final days of the war, when it became clear that Hitler planned to die in Berlin, Himmler abandoned his longtime superior to try to save himself. After serving in a reserve battalion during the First World War without seeing combat, Himmler joined the Nazi Party in 1923. In 1925, he joined the CCS, a small paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party that served as Adolf Hitler's personal guard unit. Subsequently, Himmler steadily rose through the ranks of the SS until becoming Reichsführer SS in 1929. Under Himmler's leadership, the SS grew from a battalion of 290 men into one of the most powerful institutions within Nazi Germany. Throughout his career, Himmler acquired a reputation for his strong organizational skills, as well as for selecting highly competent subordinates, such as Reinhard Heydrich. From 1943 onward, he was head of the Criminal Police, and Minister of the Interior, which gave him oversight over all internal and external police and security forces, including the Gestapo. He also controlled the Waffen-SS, a branch of the SS that fought in combat alongside the Obermajet during the Second World War. As the main executor of Nazi racial policies, Himmler was responsible for operating concentration and extermination camps, as well as forming the death squads Einsatzgruppen in German-occupied Europe. In that role, he played a central part in the genocide of approximately 5 to 6 million Jews and in the deaths of millions of other victims during the Holocaust. One day before the launch of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, Himmler commissioned the drafting of the General Plan Ost, which was approved by Hitler in May 1942 and implemented by the Nazi regime, resulting in the deaths of nearly 14 million people in Eastern Europe. The importance of Himmler in the Third Reich cannot be underestimated. Since being appointed Reichsführer SS in 1929, he expanded the Nazi forces, which initially consisted of only a battalion of 290 men, but which quickly multiplied into thousands under his command. However, in 1945, the situation was radically different. The Third Reich was increasingly cornered by the advances of the United States from France and by the Red Army in the East. After failing in his attempt to stop the Americans as Commander-in-Chief of Army Group Upper Rhine in January 1945, Himmler was once again appointed Commander-in-Chief, this time of Army Group Vistula, with the objective of stopping the Soviet Union that was relentlessly advancing toward Berlin. In hindsight, Hitler's decision proved to be a mistake. Himmler did not possess sufficient military experience for a mission of such importance. At the same time, this loyal Nazi dignitary was increasingly less convinced of Nazi Germany's ability to win the war. During those weeks of futile planning, Himmler began to behave in an increasingly erratic manner. He rarely left his train, which was not adequately equipped for the mission, as it had only a telephone line and lacked proper maps or radio to communicate with the front line. He also showed little interest in the work, viewing it as a futile effort. Himmler worked only 4 hours a day, and only after receiving a massage every morning, followed by lunch and a long nap. The lack of leadership became evident in the performance of the German army on the Eastern Front. In March 1945, the German war effort was on the verge of collapse, and Himmler's relationship with Hitler had deteriorated. Himmler considered negotiating a peace settlement independently. His masseur, Felix Skersten, who had moved to Sweden, acted as an intermediary in negotiations with Count Folke Bernadotte, head of the Swedish Red Cross. Letters were exchanged between the two men, and direct meetings were organized by Walter Schellenberg of the RSHA. Also in March 1945, Himmler issued a directive that Jews were to be marched from the fortification construction project on the southeast wall at the Austro-Hungarian border to Mauthausen. He wanted hostages for possible peace negotiations. Thousands died on the marches. Hitler and Himmler met for the last time on April 20, 1945, Hitler's birthday in Berlin, and Hitler swore unwavering loyalty to Hitler in a military meeting. That day, Hitler stated that he would not abandon Berlin despite the Soviet advances. Along with Göring, Himmler quickly left the city after the meeting. On April 21st, Himmler met with Norbert Masur, a Swedish representative of the World Jewish Congress, to discuss the release of Jewish concentration camp prisoners. As a result of these negotiations, around 20,000 people were released in the operation of the White Buses. Himmler falsely claimed at the meeting that the crematoria in the camps had been built to handle the bodies of prisoners who died in a typhus epidemic. He also claimed very high survival rates for the Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen camps, even when those places were liberated and it became evident that his claims were false. On April 23rd, Himmler met directly with Bernadotte at the Swedish consulate in Lübeck, presenting himself as the provisional leader of Germany. He claimed that Hitler would be dead in the coming days, hoping that the British and Americans would fight against the Soviets alongside what remained of the Wehrmacht. Himmler asked Bernadotte to inform General Dwight Eisenhower that Germany wished to surrender to the Western Allies and not to the Soviet Union. Bernadotte asked Hitler to put his proposal in writing, and Hitler complied. Meanwhile, Göring had sent a telegram a few hours earlier asking Hitler for permission to assume leadership of the Reich in his capacity as Hitler's deputy, an act that Hitler, under pressure from Martin Bormann, interpreted as a demand for him to resign or face a coup. On April 27th, Himmler's SS representative at Hitler's headquarters in Berlin, German Fegelein, was captured in civilian clothes, preparing to desert, was arrested and taken back to the Führer bunker. On the night of April 28th, the BBC broadcast a Reuters report on Himmler's attempts to negotiate with the Western Allies. Hitler had considered Himmler the second most loyal to him, after Joseph Goebbels, calling him the faithful Heinrich. Hitler became furious at this betrayal and told those still with him in the bunker complex that Himmler's secret negotiations were the worst betrayal he had ever known. Hitler ordered the arrest of Himmler, and Fegelein was tried and executed. At that time, the Soviets had advanced to Potsdamer Platz, only 300 meters from the Reich Chancellery, and were preparing to invade the Chancellery. This report, combined with Himmler's betrayal, led Hitler to write his testament. In the testament, completed on April 29th, one day before his suicide, Hitler declared both Himmler and Göring traitors, dismissed Himmler from all his posts in the party and the state, and expelled him from the Nazi Party. Hitler appointed Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz as his successor. Himmler met with Dönitz in Flensburg and offered to be second in command, claiming that he had the right to a position in Dönitz's provisional government as Reichsführer SS, believing that the SS would be in a good position to restore and maintain order after the war. Dönitz repeatedly rejected Himmler's initiatives and began peace negotiations with the Allies. It was only when the war broke out in 1939 that Heinrich Himmler was able to put into practice his cruel and cold policy of genocide, the extermination of entire races. However, there is little evidence that he was a sadist, that he truly enjoyed the mass murder of millions or the tortures inflicted on his victims by the Gestapo to obtain secrets and confessions. But throughout the war, he stained the name of Germany for centuries, prospered from it, and accumulated power. In the end, he was not only head of the SS, head of the Gestapo, and supreme chief of the police, but also commander-in-chief of the Home Army, head of all intelligence and counterintelligence services inside and outside the country, and Minister of the Interior. When Hitler stripped him of all his posts, Himmler could not believe that he had hit rock bottom. Events dragged him down and left him wandering through northern Germany, still with pomp and long escorts, but without any power. He wrote a letter to Field Marshal Montgomery. There was no reply. Then Admiral Dönitz, who was now serving a 10-year sentence as a Nazi war criminal in Spandau prison in Berlin, wrote to the once powerful Himmler. He told him that Hitler was dead, and that as his designated successor, he no longer needed the services of the former minister of the Reich. Dönitz then set up his puppet government at its headquarters in Flensburg, on the Baltic near the Danish border, and surrendered unconditionally to the Allies. The war in Europe had ended. The last action of the war on the continent was in Flensburg, where Dönitz and his government were arrested. The British knew that Himmler was in the area. They expected to find him in the capture of Dönitz's government, but there was no sign of him. The British were told that Himmler, stripped of his power, moved like a lost soul around the new government in the first days of peace, still with his entourage, his bodyguards, his fleet of cars. Then, a few days earlier, accompanied only by his chief aide and secretary, he disappeared. No one had seen him since. The British immediately ordered a new hunt for Himmler, alerted everyone. Intelligence officers informed the Russians and the Americans that the Nazi arch-villain had escaped their net, but they were wrong. Himmler was already in British custody. He had spent 2 days in a British prisoner of war camp at the time of the British action against Dönitz's government. The problem was that the British did not know it. On Monday, May 21, 1945, men of the famous Black Watch Regiment were searching a mixed crowd of people heading west across a small bridge over the river Oste, near Bremerverde in northern Germany. Among the forced laborers, foreigners, and other displaced persons, they noticed 3 men dressed in civilian clothes trying to cross the bridge. One was over 6 feet tall, stocky, with a bully's air, arrogant and boastful. The second was small, lightly built and quiet. Both had blonde hair, but it was the third man who caught their attention. He was of medium height, fat, clean-shaven, and over his right eye he wore a large black patch. Except for that theatrical touch, the three men could have passed unnoticed, but the men of the Black Watch were intrigued. They asked for their documents. These showed that they were former Wehrmacht soldiers. The man with the patch said his name was Jin Seeger. The guards said they did not believe his documents were in order, lifted Jin Seeger's patch and saw that his eye was unharmed. The three Germans then made another mistake. They began to shout and threaten. That was enough for the men of the Black Watch. They were not going to put up with that from any crowd, Heine or Jun. Very well, said one of them. Get in. The three men were placed on a truck and taken to the Banstead prisoner of war camp, 10 miles from the headquarters of the British Second Army in Lüneburg. There they were stripped, and their clothes were taken to be searched. No sign of poison vials was found, something Nazi leaders usually carried with them, either in their clothing or on their bodies. They were interrogated several times and made their third mistake. They told different stories each time, and their individual stories did not match. After 2 days of this, Jim Seeger's nerve broke. It was a few hours after the capture of Dönitz's government. He turned to the British sergeant who was interrogating him and said arrogantly, "It seems you do not realize who I am." "No," said the sergeant. "I am the Reich Minister, Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer of the SS," he said proudly. The sergeant looked at Himmler and with a defiant expression said, "Oh yes, well I am Winston Churchill." Jim Seeger shouted in enraged fury, "I am Himmler, idiot!" He then demanded to be taken before General Eisenhower or Montgomery. The sergeant later said that he looked at Himmler and tried to imagine what he would look like with the mustache and decorations he had seen in photos of the former official. He thought to himself, maybe he really is Himmler. In the end, the sergeant called a guard and ordered him to call Captain Sylvester, the camp commander. Jim Seeger repeated his claim to be Himmler, and Sylvester then telephoned Colonel Murphy, head of intelligence, at the headquarters of the British Second Army in Lüneburg. Murphy, after listening, replied, "Send him." Sylvester gave Himmler a British combat uniform to put on, but Himmler refused. "After putting on the khaki socks, I am not going to wear a British uniform," he burst out. "You cannot wear your own clothes," said Sylvester. "You will wear this uniform or nothing." Even so, Himmler refused. With no other options, they wrapped him in a grey army blanket, using it as a kind of dirty toga. And still wearing the socks, Himmler was placed in a jeep and taken the 10 miles to the British headquarters in Lüneburg. They stopped at number 31 Veldsener Strasse, a red brick suburban villa covered in ivy that British intelligence officers had converted into a local interrogation center. The Germans, still stunned and relieved by the defeat, paid no attention to the strange figure. As the former Prince of Terror was pushed up the front steps of the building, Himmler was shoved into the ornate hall filled with British officers, among whom was a military doctor. Some officers began to mock the strange figure wearing the blanket. The doctor examined him thoroughly, looking for any sign of hidden poison. The SS cough drops, small glass ampules with potassium cyanide that top Nazis and SS members usually carried. At one end, the ampule had a purple seal. The doctor even looked inside Himmler's mouth, turned to the others and said nothing. The interrogation began immediately. What were his plans? Despite the lack of proper clothing, Himmler was belligerent and arrogant. "I planned to hide for several weeks until the search for me relaxed, and you recovered from the first impact of victory," he added. "If I had been in Berlin when the Führer died, I would have died with him." Himmler did not know that Hitler had already discovered his betrayal by negotiating with the West. If Hitler had known of his plans, he would have killed his thriller Jain Rich like a dog, just as he had done with Hitler's henchman Zegelin shortly before his own death. Although the unpleasant former Yoki was Eva Braun's brother-in-law, Hitler's lover, Hitler did not submit him to a detailed interrogation. "I have the right to be interviewed by the General Eisenhower," he demanded pompously. He then added with deliberate disdain, I will not speak with subordinates. Whenever he had the opportunity, he launched into a long Nazi diatribe about the threat of communism and Soviet Russia to the West. Relations between East and West are already explosive. Soon you too will have to fight Russia. He prophesied today. His words do not seem as funny as they appeared to those British officers in the early days of peace. 8 years earlier, they asked him to sign his name. Eager to prove his identity, Himmler took the pen offered and wrote with hard, strong strokes, going up and down with letters nearly half a centimeter high. He handed the piece of paper to Colonel Murphy, but with the ink still wet, Himmler snatched the paper and tore it into small pieces, fearing that they might write some confession over the signature, as he himself would have done. Later, the pieces were reassembled. There was no doubt that it was Himmler's signature. The British doctor was observing Himmler and later said that he was not satisfied. The former head of the SS seemed very self-assured, as if he had some final trick up his sleeve. "Come to the light," he said to Himmler. "I want to take another look at you. Open your mouth." The doctor tilted Himmler's head back and with his index finger moved his tongue to see better. It was then that he saw the purple seal of the poison ampule, no bigger than the fingernail of a man's little finger, hidden in a cunning cavity between two back molars. The doctor made the mistake of uttering some exclamation. Himmler realized that his sure escape route had been discovered. The game was over. Was it now or never? With a quick movement of his tongue, he shifted the poison ampule and crushed it between his teeth. He gave a sigh of agony as the corrosive liquid burned his life away, then slowly shrank and collapsed on the floor. Several British officers rushed forward, grabbed him and held him upside down. Others brought a bucket of hot water with fire, held Himmler's agonizing body by the ankles and submerged him head first into the water, in and out for almost 15 minutes. It was too late to save Himmler, but they felt they needed to do something. All they managed to do was prolong his agony from seconds to several minutes. When there was no doubt that he was dead, they placed his body on the bare boards. There was no atmosphere of victory and triumph among the British. On the contrary, they were subdued. They had let a great reward slip through their fingers. Himmler knew more than any other man about the plans for German underground resistance against the Allies, and that, in the early days with Germany still in chaos, was of supreme importance. But Himmler ultimately chose to live according to the code of his own agents. He revealed nothing, taking all his information and secrets with him. Even so, his two companions remained, the robust aide and the thin secretary, in British hands at Banstedt prison. They could talk. If you feel this video brought you value in any way, please subscribe to the channel. Fasvim series. See you soon.